The room is filled with flashes of light, cameras, reporters, a wall of microphones. Outside, Jerusalem hums with the tension of a nation that knows something irreversible has just begun. Benjamin Netanyahu steps to the podium. For a moment, the room is silent. Then he speaks. If we do not stop Iran's nuclear and missile programs now, they will soon become immune. The words are calm, measured, but their meaning is unmistakable. Israel has begun the war he spent a lifetime warning about. For nearly 40 years, Netanyahu has told anyone who would listen that Iran represents an existential threat to the Jewish state. Through elections, through wars, through diplomatic crises and fragile alliances, the message never changed. Iran must be stopped. Now, in the winter of 2026, the moment he spent decades preparing for has finally arrived. Israeli aircraft are already in the air. Missiles have already struck their targets. Across the Middle East, military commands are moving into emergency mode. To Netanyahu and his supporters, this is the culmination of 4 decades of warnings finally taken seriously. The decisive strike that would prevent catastrophe, the war that would secure Israel's future. But almost immediately, a dangerous question begins to surface. What if the war he waited for is not the war he expected? What if the quick surgical victory promised for years does not exist? And what if the gamble meant to define Netanyahu's legacy becomes the moment it begins to unravel? To understand how the region arrived at this moment, we have to go back 3 decades, to the beginning of a political idea that would eventually reshape the Middle East, because long before the bombs began falling, there was a warning, and one man who never stopped repeating it. In the early 1990s, Benjamin Netanyahu was still rising through the ranks of Israeli politics. He was not yet the towering figure he would become, not yet the longest-serving prime minister in Israel's history. But even then, one theme already dominated his thinking: Iran. At the time, the Islamic Republic was still recovering from the devastating Iran-Iraq War. Its economy was fragile, its military power limited. To many observers, Iran appeared to be a regional problem, serious but manageable. Netanyahu saw something different. He believed Iran was slowly building the capability to threaten Israel's very existence, not just through conventional weapons, but through something far more dangerous: nuclear power. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, this belief began to define his political identity. Speech after speech, interview after interview, Netanyahu returned to the same warning. Iran was pursuing nuclear weapons, and if the world ignored it, the consequences would be catastrophic. To his supporters, he was sounding an alarm that others were too complacent to hear. To his critics, he was exaggerating, a threat to justify confrontation. But Netanyahu never softened his language. In Washington, he lobbied American lawmakers. At international conferences, he warned diplomats. Inside Israel, he framed the issue in existential terms. For him, the lesson of Jewish history was clear. Threats to the Jewish people must never be ignored until it is too late. Again and again, he repeated the same message. Iran cannot be allowed to cross the nuclear threshold. By the late 2000s, Netanyahu had become the most visible international voice, arguing that Iran's nuclear program must be stopped, by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. The warning became the central thread running through his career. Presidencies came and went in Washington, governments rose and fell in Israel. But Netanyahu's message remained remarkably consistent. Iran was not simply another geopolitical rival. It was the defining threat of the era, and one day, he believed, the world would realize he had been right all along. The question was never whether the confrontation would come, only when. And when that moment arrived, Netanyahu intended to be the leader who finally acted. For years, the confrontation between Israel and Iran existed mostly in the realm of warnings, speeches, intelligence briefings, diplomatic pressure. But behind closed doors, another conversation was taking place. Inside Israeli military headquarters, planners were studying a different option: What if diplomacy failed? What if Iran continued advancing its nuclear program? In that scenario, Israel had only one real choice left: a military strike. The idea was deceptively simple: a fast, precise operation designed to cripple Iran's most critical military and nuclear infrastructure. Stealth aircraft would penetrate Iranian airspace, missiles would target enrichment facilities, command centers and missile bases would be hit simultaneously. The objective was not invasion, not occupation, just a decisive blow. Supporters of the strategy believed it could change the balance of power overnight, destroy the key facilities, delay the nuclear program by years, shock the Iranian leadership, and perhaps even destabilize the regime itself. In theory, the operation would be swift, measured in days, maybe weeks, not months. But within Israel's military establishment, not everyone shared this confidence. Senior officers and intelligence analysts began raising uncomfortable questions. Iran was not Iraq in 1981, when Israeli jets destroyed Saddam Hussein's Osirak reactor in a single daring raid. Nor was it Syria in 2007, when another Israeli strike eliminated a secret nuclear facility before it could be completed. Iran was something entirely different: a vast country, nearly 85 million people, a military spread across mountains, deserts, and underground installations. Its nuclear infrastructure was not concentrated in one location. It was dispersed, hardened, protected, and perhaps most importantly, Iran had spent decades preparing for the possibility of exactly this kind of attack. Missiles, drones, proxy militias across the region, all designed to ensure that if war ever came, it would not remain limited for long. Inside Israeli war rooms, the debate became increasingly stark. Could a surgical strike truly end the threat, or would it ignite a far larger conflict? A war of retaliation, a war of endurance, a war of attrition. Exactly the kind of war Israel had always tried to avoid. But in politics, as in war, momentum can become difficult to stop. The warnings continued, the plans continued, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hypothetical war began moving closer to reality. February 28, 2026. In the early hours of the morning, long before sunrise touches the hills surrounding Jerusalem, the first aircraft begin to move. Israeli air bases that had been quiet for months suddenly come alive. Ground crews move quickly beneath dim floodlights. Fuel lines are connected. Weapons are mounted. Pilots walk across the tarmac in silence. For years, many of them had trained for this exact mission. Now, the order has finally arrived. Hundreds of miles away, deep inside Iran, radar operators stare into their screens as unfamiliar signals begin to appear. At first, they are faint. Then, they multiply. Within minutes, alarms begin sounding across military installations. Something is happening, and it is happening fast. Above the desert, Israeli aircraft are already crossing into Iranian airspace. Moments later, the first explosions tear through the darkness. Missiles strike air defense systems. Drones target communication nodes. Precision bombs fall on military facilities connected to Iran's nuclear and missile programs. The operation that had been debated for decades is now underway. For Netanyahu, the moment carries enormous symbolic weight. For almost 40 years, he had warned that Iran's ambitions could not be ignored forever. Now, he is the leader who has chosen to act. Inside Israel, government officials describe the attack in familiar terms: necessary, preventive, a strike designed to stop a future catastrophe before it becomes irreversible. Supporters believe this is the moment history will vindicate Netanyahu's warnings, a decisive action taken before it was too late. But wars rarely unfold according to the plans that begin them. Within hours, Iran's leadership vows retaliation. Missile batteries begin mobilizing. Allied militias across the Middle East receive instructions. The conflict that was supposed to remain controlled and precise begins spreading outward. The surgical strike that had been promised for years is already beginning to look like something else, something slower, something larger, and something far more dangerous than anyone publicly predicted. At first glance, the balance of power, Between Israel and Iran appears straightforward. Israel possesses one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. Its air force is among the most capable anywhere. Its intelligence services are legendary. Its missile defense systems are designed to intercept threats traveling at extraordinary speeds. By almost every conventional measure, Israel appears to hold the advantage. But Iran has never built its military strategy around conventional strength. Instead, it spent decades developing something very different, a strategy designed not to win wars quickly, but to make them impossible to end. Iran's military doctrine revolves around what strategists call asymmetric warfare, fighting stronger opponents indirectly across multiple fronts in ways that make traditional victories difficult to achieve. Rather than relying solely on its own army, Tehran invested heavily in building a network of allied forces across the Middle East. Over the years, this network expanded into what Iranian leaders sometimes call the axis of resistance. In Lebanon, Hezbollah emerged as the most powerful non-state military force in the region. In Iraq, a web of Shiite militias developed close ties with Iran's Revolutionary Guard. In Syria, Iranian advisors and allied fighters helped sustain the government during years of civil war. And in Yemen, the Houthi movement evolved from a local insurgency into a force capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. Each group operates with its own leadership and its own agenda, but all of them share one crucial characteristic. They extend Iran's reach far beyond its own borders. This strategy gives Tehran something strategists call strategic depth. An attack on Iran does not necessarily remain confined to Iran. It can trigger responses in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, sometimes all at once. And these responses rarely take the form of traditional battlefield engagements. Instead, they come through rockets, through drones, through sudden strikes on military bases, shipping lanes, and infrastructure across the region. In recent years, Iran has also invested heavily in drone technology, building thousands of inexpensive unmanned aircraft capable of striking targets far from Iranian territory. Compared to modern fighter jets, these drones are cheap, but their strategic value lies in numbers, dozens, sometimes hundreds, launched in coordinated waves. Over time, this combination of proxy forces, missiles, and drones created a system designed to stretch any opponent across multiple battlefields simultaneously. A system designed not necessarily to defeat a stronger military head-on, but to exhaust it, to complicate its decisions, to raise the cost of every escalation, which meant that when Israel launched its strike against Iran in 2026, it was never just confronting one country. It was confronting an entire network, a network built patiently over decades, and once that network began to move, the war would no longer belong to a single battlefield. In modern warfare, victory often depends on speed. Strike quickly. Overwhelm the opponent, end the conflict before it has time to expand. This is the kind of war Israel's military was designed to fight. Since its founding in 1948, Israel has faced a fundamental strategic problem. It is a small country, its population is limited, its economy depends on stability. That means long wars are dangerous. They disrupt daily life, strain the economy, and place enormous pressure on the military reserves that make up a large portion of Israel's armed forces. Because of this, Israeli military doctrine has traditionally emphasized short, decisive campaigns, wars that end before the country's strategic vulnerabilities begin to show. Against Iran, however, that model immediately began to break down. In the first days of the conflict, Israeli aircraft successfully struck several key targets. Air defense systems were damaged, military facilities were destroyed, and intelligence agencies reported significant disruption to parts of Iran's missile infrastructure. But Iran's military strategy had never depended on preventing the first strike. It depended on surviving it. The country's military assets were scattered across vast territory. Facilities were buried deep underground. Missile launchers were mobile. Command structures were designed to operate even after heavy damage, which meant that once the initial wave of attacks ended, the war did not end with it. Instead, the retaliation began. Missiles were launched toward Israeli territory. Drone attacks targeted military installations and strategic infrastructure. Across the region, Iranian-aligned militias began opening additional fronts. Suddenly, the conflict was no longer confined to a single exchange of strikes. It was becoming something far more complicated. A cycle. Strike, retaliate, strike again. Each side probing the other, each side testing how much pressure the other could absorb. Days turned into weeks, weeks threatened to become months, and this was precisely the scenario many Israeli strategists had feared. Because wars of attrition follow a different logic. They are not decided by the first strike, or even the second. They are decided by endurance, by which side can sustain pressure longer, by which economy can continue functioning, by which population can tolerate uncertainty, fear, and disruption over time. Israel had the technological advantage, but Iran had something else: scale, geography, and a strategy built specifically to stretch conflicts beyond the point where quick victories are possible, which meant that the war Netanyahu believed would be decisive was slowly transforming into something far more dangerous. A test of endurance. And endurance is a battlefield where the outcome is rarely predictable. For decades, one assumption quietly shaped Israel's strategic thinking. No matter how tense the Middle East became, the United States would stand firmly beside it. The alliance between Washington and Jerusalem had been one of the most stable partnerships in modern geopolitics. Military cooperation, intelligence sharing, billions of dollars in defense assistance, American weapon systems formed the backbone of Israel's military power. And in moments of crisis, Israel believed it could rely on the political support of its most powerful ally. But by the time the war with Iran began in 2026, that assumption was no longer as certain as it once had been. In Washington, political priorities had shifted. President Donald Trump had built much of his political identity around a simple promise: avoid endless wars. For years, American voters had grown weary of long military conflicts in the Middle East. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, each had begun with clear objectives. Each had evolved into something far more complicated. Trump understood this political reality better than most. To him, foreign policy was rarely about ideology. It was about leverage, deals, negotiations, results that could be declared quickly and then moved past. And a war with Iran offered very few of those advantages. Iran was large, its population was vast, its geography difficult, and any serious military campaign risked pulling the United States back into the kind of open-ended conflict Trump had repeatedly promised to avoid. Which meant Washington's position began to shift. Publicly, the United States expressed support for Israel's security. Privately, American officials signaled caution. There would be intelligence cooperation, there would be defensive support, but committing American ground forces or launching a full-scale war against Iran was a very different question, and it was a question the White House appeared reluctant to answer. For Netanyahu, this created a strategic dilemma. The war he had pushed for decades to confront was finally underway. But if the conflict continued to expand, Israel might find itself carrying far more of the burden than anyone had originally planned. In previous Middle Eastern conflicts, American involvement had often served as the ultimate stabilizing force. Now, that certainty was fading, and if Washington eventually decided to step back, Israel could find itself facing a prolonged confrontation with Iran largely on its own, a scenario that very few leaders in Jerusalem had ever seriously wanted to test. Wars in the Middle East rarely stay confined to the battlefield. The region sits at the center of one of the most sensitive arteries of the global economy, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is barely 30 miles wide. Yet through this corridor passes nearly a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas, tankers carrying energy to Europe, to Asia, to the United States. Every day, an enormous portion of the global economy moves through this single passage, which means that when conflict erupts near Hormuz, the consequences ripple far beyond the region. Within days of the Israeli strikes, markets begin to react. Oil traders watch satellite images and shipping reports with growing anxiety. Insurance rates for commercial tankers begin to climb. Shipping companies quietly start rerouting vessels. The fear is not simply that oil facilities might be damaged, it is that the strait itself could become unsafe. Iran has long signaled that if its own security were threatened, it possessed the ability to disrupt traffic through Hormuz, naval mines, anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, drones. It would not take much to create chaos. Even the perception of danger can be enough. Energy markets are built on expectations, and expectations shift quickly in times of war. Within days, oil prices surge. Fuel costs begin rising in countries thousands of miles from the battlefield. Transportation becomes more expensive. Manufacturing costs climb. Economists begin issuing warnings about inflation. Some even begin whispering about recession. And suddenly, a conflict that began as a regional military operation becomes something else entirely. A global economic shock. Governments far removed from the Middle East begin paying close attention. European leaders worry about energy supplies. Asian economies fear disruptions to shipping lanes. In Washington, the political stakes begin rising as gasoline prices creep upward, because wars do not exist in isolation. They intersect with trade, with markets, with the daily lives of people who may never hear a missile or see a battlefield. And as the war between Israel and Iran continues, its consequences begin spreading outward from military bases to oil markets, to the global economy itself. What began as a strategic gamble between two nations is rapidly becoming a crisis that the entire world must now navigate. For Benjamin Netanyahu, the war with Iran is not just another conflict, it is the culmination of a political life. Few modern leaders have tied their identity to a single geopolitical threat as completely as Netanyahu tied his to Iran. For decades, he warned that Iran's nuclear ambitions represented the greatest danger facing Israel. Long before many Western governments treated the issue as urgent, Netanyahu was already speaking about it in stark existential terms. At the United Nations, in the U.S. Congress, in countless interviews and speeches, the message was always the same. If Iran acquired nuclear weapons, Israel's security would be fundamentally threatened. And if the world failed to stop it, Israel would eventually have to act alone. That warning became the defining thread running through his career. Supporters saw him as a leader who understood the stakes earlier than anyone else. A man willing to confront a danger others preferred to manage or delay. But critics saw something different. They argued that Netanyahu had built an entire political narrative around Iran. That every diplomatic crisis, every intelligence report, every regional conflict was interpreted through the same lens. To them, Iran was not just a strategic concern, it had become a political centerpiece, a justification for hardline policies and military preparedness. Now, after decades of speeches and warnings, Netanyahu had finally made the decision he had spent a lifetime contemplating. He had ordered the strike. If the war ended quickly, if Iran's nuclear program was crippled, if the region stabilized afterward, Netanyahu would likely be remembered as the leader who prevented a historic catastrophe, a man who acted when others hesitated. But if the conflict dragged on, if the region spiraled into prolonged instability, or if Israel became trapped in a war without a clear conclusion, the judgment of history could look very different. Because political legacies are rarely defined by intentions, they are defined by outcomes. For Netanyahu, the stakes of this war were never just strategic. They were personal. His reputation, his legacy, perhaps even his place in history. All of it now rested on the outcome of a conflict he had spent nearly 40 years preparing to fight. And the longer the war continued, the more uncertain that outcome began to appear. As the war unfolds, the conflict is no longer defined only by missiles and military strategy. It is also shaped by two very different leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem, Donald Trump in Washington. For Netanyahu, the confrontation with Iran has always been deeply personal. It is the issue that has defined his worldview, the threat he warned about for decades, the danger he believes history will judge leaders for either confronting or ignoring. In his mind, The logic is clear. Iran's ambitions must be stopped before they reach the point of no return. Waiting only makes the danger worse. Delay only strengthens the enemy. Trump, however, approaches the situation from a very different perspective. For him, geopolitics is less about historical narratives or ideological struggles. It is about leverage, about negotiating power, about deals. His instinct has always been to avoid long, complicated military commitments, wars that drag on for years, conflicts that drain resources and political capital without producing a clear, immediate victory. To Trump, a confrontation with Iran is not a historic mission, it is a risk, one that could spiral into the kind of prolonged Middle Eastern war American voters have grown tired of watching. And so, the priorities of the two leaders begin to diverge. Netanyahu wants resolve, pressure, sustained confrontation until Iran's capabilities are decisively weakened. Trump wants flexibility, options, an exit strategy that allows the United States to step away before the conflict expands. For years, the partnership between Washington and Jerusalem had appeared nearly unbreakable. But now, under the pressure of a growing war, the alliance is being tested. Because in crises like this, strategy is never shaped by one leader alone. It is shaped by the intersection of two different calculations, two different political realities, and two different visions of how the conflict should end. As the war drags on, those differences begin to matter more and more. In the beginning, the war was supposed to be simple, a decisive strike, a limited confrontation, a short campaign designed to remove a dangerous threat before it could fully emerge. But weeks into the conflict, the reality looks very different. Iran has not collapsed, its leadership remains in control. Missiles and drones continue to appear in the skies over the region. Militias across multiple countries remain active. The conflict has expanded beyond a single battlefield, and the quick victory many had once imagined is nowhere in sight. Instead, the war has settled into something far more complicated. A grinding confrontation, a test of endurance between two countries that both believe they cannot afford to lose. For Netanyahu, the stakes are enormous. For nearly 40 years, he warned that Iran represented the greatest threat facing Israel. He built alliances around that warning. He shaped his political identity around it, and eventually he acted on it. Now the outcome of the war will determine how that decision is remembered. If the conflict ultimately weakens Iran and prevents its nuclear ambitions, Netanyahu may be seen as the leader who confronted a danger others were unwilling to face. But if the war drags on, if the region becomes more unstable, if the costs continue to rise without a clear strategic victory, the judgment may be harsher. Because history has a complicated relationship with leaders driven by certainty. Sometimes they are remembered as visionaries, other times as men who mistook conviction for wisdom. For Netanyahu, the war with Iran was meant to resolve a question that had followed him throughout his career. Was the threat he described truly as urgent as he believed, or had the warning slowly evolved into something else, an obsession? Now, as the conflict continues to unfold, that question remains unanswered, and the gamble that was meant to define his legacy is still playing out in real time.